Okay, this is why the Buddha was born, to test our capacity for patience. I won't say too much about myself. I teach future studies mostly in Zhuhai, including courses like artificial intelligence and the future of the mind and sense-making in the digital society, and so on. But I'm quite interested in human cognition and consciousness studies as well, which is something that I've studied for many years. And as part of my project called the Power and Presence Project, which is also a book, it's also a YouTube channel, it's also on my website, mind-futures.com. Okay, a few definitions. So what am I talking about? Well, AI is a very broad term, and it can mean a lot of things, but I'm mostly focusing on the digital society and especially the way that it affects cognition or the way we use our minds, okay? And I'm going to bring in ideas related to the use of generative AI like ChatGPT and those kinds of things, and social media use, gaming, in very broad terms, okay? So what is the traditional Chinese mind? Well, my suggestion is there's no one mind, but I'm focusing today on certain aspects of the traditional Chinese mind. So syncretic cultures tend to be syncretic. They borrow from each other and they change over time, and they'll continue to change in the future. China's huge, it's got a long history, so I'm just pulling out some common themes from my personal understanding, which is, of course, imperfect. Now, some of the ideas that I'm going to move through today, including some of these traditional Chinese concepts, mostly taken from Taoism and Buddhism, and they're also in Neo-Confucianism as well, like the idea of Tianxia, living under one heaven, and or the mandate of heaven, Hexie, or harmony, the Tao, or the way, Yin-Yang, the male-female principle, and Wu-Wei, which is sometimes translated as effortless action. Now, the emphasis here is that these all require intuition and connection to something beyond us. So this is an important distinction as I go further. So what's the aim of my talk? Pretty much just to suggest a possible continuity between the traditional Chinese mind today and the futures of the digital society, especially in the Chinese context. But I'm also going to suggest that it has implications for the entire world as well. Continuities can we expect from the past to the present to the future? So I'm going to go into a few there. Are there any opportunities also, any positive aspects to what's happening online in virtual realities that can actually enhance some of these traditional ways of knowing and ways of being? Spiritual well-being, psychological well-being is an important part of what I'm talking about here. Okay. And okay, the digital society. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are occurring in the digital society, both in China and worldwide. You might notice some of these pictures are actually created by my chat box, as it's called, which is links into ChatGPT. So this is some of the really good things I think about these technologies. You can get images and symbols and kind of artwork which can help to create communication and understanding. So this one I just created from my chatbot. And I asked the machine basically to give me an angry young man who's on the internet and being perhaps affected negatively. And what I like about this one is, besides the fact that he looks like some of my students, he's got 1, I think 2, 3 phones on him. Okay, so exteroception, or the outward gaze, tends to be predominant in digital culture. So we lose connection with the body and our intuitions. And surveillance capitalism is an idea put forward by Shoshana Zuboff. I think she's somewhere in New York, one of those universities. And this is an important concept for understanding how monetization occurs on the internet and how advertising impacts how algorithms are created and what we're fed online. So basically her main argument is that we're being exploited by big tech companies who herd us into online forums in order to sell us advertise to us to buy products, to optimize profits for the advertisers and for the big tech companies, and our own well-being is not necessarily their prime concern. Okay. The AI explosion is the period in history that we're in now, I believe. It's what I call it. It really is in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say beginning around 2021, when the VR spaces started to expand with the idea of the metaverse. Anyone remember that? Okay. It kind of imploded, but VR environments are obviously still going to come back and be a big part of the future. And then, of course, in November 2022, ChatGPT, and now we've got all these generative AI technologies coming through. Now, Meta, which is basically Facebook, set up an agenda so that they would try to get all the aspects of life into one online platform. And so that social life, personal life, economics, banking, everything could occur on one platform. And I've got a little bit more about that. So Mark Zuckerberg, when he was announcing this, when metaverse was a hot thing, suggested that there would be no logging off. And of course, this pressed a few people's buttons because it sounded something like from a science fiction movie. But he says himself, it's going to become increasingly difficult to tell the difference between the real world and the online world. It's a bit of an exaggeration in terms of time frame, I think, but in the future it's quite likely, I think, that will be increasingly the case. So here's our friend again. The crisis in sense-making, I think, is a big part of the digital society. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that it's becoming harder to know what's true and what's real in the modern context, because the information in the world we get is increasingly from online forums and platforms. I think in the United States, 7 hours a day online on a mobile devices is quite normal for young people, and that's a lot. Okay. There's a fragmentation of society, there's increasing distrust in governments and institutions, and there's a meaning crisis. People don't really quite know what to make of life anymore. The traditional societies or philosophies have generally receded in their importance in people's lives. Now does anyone recognize this church front here? Macau? It's in Macau, yeah. It's St. Paul's. I believe in 1835 it was blown down by a typhoon. Maybe that was the wrath of God or something, I don't know. But the irony is that it's just a shell of what it is, and yet these people come to look at this. It's almost as if they're seeking something that they've lost from the past, just before they go to the casinos and blow all their money, of course. Okay, such is the modern world. Okay, deepening futures. So I believe it's important to deepen our analysis and understanding and attempts to understand who we are in relationship to the future. And I think China has an important possible role to play in this, okay? And the methodology I'm using will help to do that. I've got this yin-yang symbol here. It's in water form. Of course, many of you would know that water metaphors are a very important part of Taoism, because the idea is that there are ways to move through life, like an eddy or a current or water down the stream, in a path of least resistance. Okay, what is critical future studies? It's a discipline, and it's been around for at least 50 years, since the 1970s. The main purpose of this is really to think deeply about the future and to question it and create preferred futures. It's not just about trying to predict things or do trends analysis, which is what people sometimes think of when they're talking about futures studies. And there are lots of organizations, and they're parts of some departments around the Asia region. There's a very big department at Tamkang University in Taiwan, for example, where I've been quite a few times. And I've spoken in these countries here. I've spoken in Thailand, Malaysia, of course in China and Taiwan, of course around the China region, and where else around here? South Korea as well. Okay, so critical future studies emerges really from the postmodern tradition, and I won't go into this, but basically criticality is the idea that we can question things that would be traditional and that we might not think about deeply. Structuralism and critical theory are an aspect of this, but since we're running out of time, I'm not going to go on to it. Now, there are at least 6 parts or pillars of future studies, and this is put forward by the UNESCO Chair in Future Studies called Sohail Inayatullah. So anticipation is the second one, which is really predicting. That's only a part of future studies. It's also important to think about mapping past to present to future. Are there any patterns through history that we can see? Timing. We have to be very careful what we're saying about time. If we're talking about prediction or talking about the future, are we talking 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? In this talk, I'm mostly talking about the next 10 years. It's very hard to talk about extremely long-term futures. Deepening is asking more profound questions about the future, not just about identifying trends. Creating alternatives is the imagination. What kind of future would we prefer to live in? Transforming the future is the world of strategy. How are we going to get from here to there? So these are all things that futurists do. Okay. Very quickly, a method that I'm using implicitly in this talk is called causal layered analysis, and this is also by Sohail Inayatullah. And there are 4 levels to this analysis. These are really 4 parts of problems or futures that we can think about as we try to work on analyzing the future or creating preferred futures. So the litany really is the superficial level, what people might normally talk about, or organizations or governments where they want you to focus. It's the world of propaganda and policy documents and so on. Society and systems is also an important part of the future. So we need to look at how social structures impact the future. And this is usually a part of most futures analysis. Now, when we get into the last 2, though, this is more implicit or intangible aspects of problems. Worldviews and paradigms are really normally carried by people unconsciously or by organizations and cultures unconsciously. And they're models and ways of thinking and ways of being that people may not actually know, but they're part of their conditioned selves. And lastly, myths, metaphors, and mind. This is the 3rd level, or the 4th level rather. And myths are really stories that we tell ourselves or are a part of our cultures. They can be old stories, they can be new stories. Language, the kind of metaphors we use, also is very important in how we understand things. For example, if we're talking about the future of the mind, are we thinking of the mind as a computer? Like Din now suggests that the computer is an electric brain. But what are the distinctions between a computer and a mind? And how does that affect our belief in the understanding of what consciousness is? So the language we use can sometimes restrict how we're thinking. States of consciousness are also important because different cultures have different states of consciousness which they think are normal. And this can result in very different understandings and perceptions of the world. Very quickly, 5 key concepts from future studies. I'm going to do this in like 10 seconds each. So there are many possible futures, not just one future. And the second one, there are futures of many different things, not just what I call money and machines futures, which means technocentric futures. People tend to think of flying cars or a faster internet, materialism as the future, but of course it's multi-perspective. There are many different parts of it. The future is not set, it can be created and changed. Now, this is an issue for some cultures that don't believe it can, or some individuals who feel victimized and don't believe they can change their own future. Okay? The 4th point is, so it's not just about prediction, it's how to shape it, how to think deeply about it. And lastly, we can think of futures as possible, probable, and preferred futures. Okay, the Chinese mind. So ways of being are definitely part of any understanding of mind in any culture. So this incorporates typical ways of relating to the mind, body, and to nature and society. Okay. Ways of knowing, it's really cognitive structures. And Ken Wilber, who's a pretty well-known philosopher, talks about 3 ways of knowing. There are other ways to frame this, right? But he talks about the intuitive realm, which is really the realm of meditation or spirituality. Reason, which is really the world of philosophy and analysis. And experiment, which is really the world of science and measurement. Now, all these have their valid places, I'm arguing, in society, but they may be inappropriate in some spheres. So let's just quickly mention a few of these. Most of you will be familiar with these. Taoism is a very important aspect of Chinese tradition and culture. And Lao Tzu lived, or possibly some people argued whether he was a real person or not, but about 2,500 years ago. The Tao Te Ching is the seminal text. Ideas like the Tao, yin-yang, harmony, wu-wei, as I'll explain in a moment, are the most common aspects of this philosophy. Buddhism also deeply affected China just a little bit later, maybe 4 centuries later, when it was imported from India. Okay, and it was deeply introspective. It is deeply introspective. Compassion and balance are all part of Buddhism. And so this deeply impacted Taoism as well, and later on Confucianism. So Confucius, of course, lived around about the same time as Lao Tzu, a little bit later. And the dominant period, I believe, was the Han Dynasty, 3rd century AD. Later, it brought in ideas from Buddhism and Taoism and became a Neo-Confucianism. So Confucianism is a little bit more structured and strict and hierarchical. There's familial piety, morality are very important parts of that, responsibility to the society, and so on, very important. So all these things were brought together into Neo-Confucianism. I guess you can say that modern society is more Neo-Confucianist than strictly Taoist or Buddhist. They're all combined, along with the more material modern world as well. Now the main point from this is, how did people intuit or understand what the Tao was? This is the idea. The Tao is the idea that there's some way to move through life that you can employ your intuition and move through with a greater sense of harmony and balance and least resistance from the world. Well, there are a number of ways that people did that. They used introspective and meditative processes, especially after Buddhism came to China. They also had sages and people they consulted with, the texts that they would read. There were sages. The sage culture was also very important in this. So wise people, usually men, but that you would go and talk to and work out the best way to live your life, make decisions in alignment with nature or the Tao. Okay, the Tao is famously kind of nebulous and poetic and full of riddles. That's the way it is. Yin Yang is the masculine and feminine. It suggests that balance and harmony between opposing forces is important, and we need to integrate the opposite or the shadow of what we are. That's the way I interpret it anyway. Equilibrium and harmony, again, are very closely related to the idea of yin and yang. Wu Wei is, again, quite similar, non-action or effortless action. So you move through the world with least resistance. So obviously it's very closely related to the idea of Taoism. These Tai Chi, I suspect they're doing Tai Chi, possibly Kung Fu. I think this was taken in 2008 for the Beijing Olympics, this picture. But people work together in harmony, and that's one of the main ideas taken from Taoism and Wu Wei in particular. So harmony, Hershier, of course, I think the president of this university is very big into this concept, I believe, so I've been told. Again, this is working with other people, with nature, so that things are in balance. So it's a very important and fundamental value in Taoism. Now here's a passage from the Tao Te Ching. I'm not going to read it all, but this comes from chapter or verse 66. And one of the riddles it puts forward, and it's different in different translations, this is the English translation, or one English translation, is, why is the sea a master of 1,000 streams? Or 1,000 rivers, or 10,000 rivers, depending how you interpret it. And the answer is it's because it lies below them. So this suggests an unusual inverted relationship of power to the people. The sea is obviously much bigger and more powerful and more expansive than the rivers, but in lying below them it has a receptive or feminine quality to it, which allows a natural order to occur. So in other words, it's suggesting the boss shouldn't try to boss you around too much. Okay, I like this verse from the Tao Te Ching because I think it's also related to the idea of intuition. Now this translation of the text here is that without going outside or looking out the window, you can know the world. Now, if this is taken to be literally true, it suggests that the mind is not located purely in the body, but there's a non-local mind implicit in consciousness. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I think it's a very important part of traditional cultures. Many traditional cultures believe that the mind is not simply located in the body, but it transcends the body. And this is a big part of prayer and spiritual tradition. Now, the key distinction I would like to make in terms of the digital society, if we have harmony, we need to be able to connect with people at a personal level, connect with society, and connect with nature. So if we disconnect ourselves from those things, we then lose the capacity for harmony or deep connection. And I believe this actually has a kind of a traumatizing effect on people, especially young people in the modern age, which is one of the reasons why, especially in America and Western countries, levels of anxiety and depression and suicidality have really skyrocketed. And there's not merely a correlation, it seems, with internet use, but it appears to be a causal factor, although there's some disputes about that. Now, another key point here is that, especially generative AI, it outsources our inspiration to the machine, okay? Which can be fantastic. I mean, this picture I put here, actually, I think this is a wonderful little picture. I used this on one of my social media blogs about author Natalie Goldberg writing her book, Writing Down the Bones, it's called, and how she uses inspiration in her own writing. But she was writing that book 25 years ago, and it's a very successful book. So AI created this. Actually, my editor created this one. Okay, so I think it's a very nice picture. So I think, again, I think there's a positive side to generative AI, but there's also some benefit in us relaxing and being able to connect with our own intelligence and intelligences or inspiration beyond us. Okay, and if we rely on the machine too much, then we lose that connection and that wisdom with ourselves. And if it happens on a society-wide basis, maybe our entire society loses that connection. And that would be a very bad thing. Again, here's our friend once again. But the question is, for inspiration, do we relax or do we move ourselves into a state of heightened arousal? There's actually conflicting data on this. There's certainly many kinds of inspiration which require a deeper state of consciousness and relaxation. Basically, you can go from gamma level to beta level, where we normally are, down to alpha, theta, and delta. These are deeper levels of consciousness. Like when you sleep, one of the reasons why you have dreams is that things start to come up. Normally in theta, or around the theta level normally in sleep. Okay, so we definitely need relaxation for inspiration. And if we're too agitated, there's evidence that overuse of gaming and internet, it locks us into a more of a beta level of consciousness, which is characterized by stress hormones like cortisone and epinephrine, and these may retard our capacity for relaxed and mindful states. But on the other hand, many of the famous people in history used stimulants to get themselves into an excited state for, like cocaine was once quite popular. People forget. I'm not recommending you use cocaine, by the way. Freud and R.L. Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island, Hemingway, they all used those things. So there seems to be a use for both stimulation and relaxation. The internet may be causing us, though, to become overstimulated. Okay, let's just quickly mention a few of these ideas from modern science now, which may help to lend some legitimacy and also help us to understand how we can solve some of these problems in the modern age. Now, one idea that I put forward is digital wisdom, and that is, in order to really understand ourselves in the modern world, we need more than just understanding of technologies, which is like digital literacy. We also need to understand ourselves, to know ourselves, and to know something about how humans function biologically and culturally. So I won't go into this, but this is a part of a framework which I developed in order to how to move forward. Now, the nature effect is extremely important, I think, in building preferred futures. So when we go out into nature, it has a profound effect on our cognition. Okay. For example, in a moment I'll talk quickly about the way it changes your vision. Okay. when we go out into nature, especially into expansive scenery, our peripheral vision opens up and it makes us relax. It improves our sense of spatial memory and how things fit together and synthesize. It also gives us a more positive, intuitive feeling for the future as well. That's been shown to be true in various studies. Urban environments, on the other hand, tend to make us more competitive, and there's some evidence that it may make us more impulsive and less able to discipline ourselves and delay gratification, which is an important part of life. Also, nature inspires awe and wonder. These are extremely important experiences to have in order to understand our relationship with the world. If you go outside at night time and see the stars, this has a profound effect on human cognition. And we really need to make sure that we keep these experiences as we move forward. Now, the expansive gaze is really more or less what I said. Peripheral vision is extremely important in our understanding of the world and who we are, and in balancing our well-being. Now, when you're staring at a phone which is like 3 inches wide for too long, it severely retards that capacity. So it's very important to get outside every day and at the very least look at environments, even if they're urbanscapes, that have a wider visual space. And in the future, as put forward by Robert Ball and other people, perhaps the best idea is to invest in expansive monitors, which is what some schools do now. I've been in one school in Malaysia, for example, which has 3 huge monitors on the wall. And so the students their peripheral vision opens up. The only problem is it costs $25,000 but other than that, it's all good. In futures, VR mindscapes, landscapes may be able to tap into this peripheral. They will be able to. We just have to get over the awkwardness of how the eyes function. Because what's it called? Pixelity is a problem with some of these monitors. Noticing techniques are very important, and we should be teaching these, I think, to people. That's being able to notice what is occurring in your body. It's a kind of a mindfulness process. Again, the simple act of sitting down and noticing what's occurring in your body reduces stress hormones. Okay, and so this is a simple technique which comes from many of these traditional philosophies and practices, and very easy to teach people. The mindfulness movement, of course, is tapping into this. Biophilic design is something we can also tap into. This basically means designing our environments in alignment with the principles of nature and the patterns of nature. And this can be both in the real world, but also in virtual world. Okay. So, for example, even looking at this picture here, your mind or your brain is probably already responding in a kind of positive way. So even visual images can have an impact on mind if they're related to nature. Journaling is also something I highly recommend. I do it for my students, especially when people record how they feel in relationship to what's happening. There are many benefits of this. It can really help to improve people's intuition, their intuitive intelligence. Okay. And this is just a list of obvious things that people can do, and policymakers can encourage in schools and elsewhere. These physical practices like, doing Kung Fu, Wushu, Tai Chi, meditation, just sport and exercise. Less time spent on mobile phones. Kids who are under 16 definitely should not be spending too much time online. And if they're under 10, the effects of social media can be extremely damaging on them, including, especially girls. And this is some of the research coming out, especially from Jonathan Haidt in the US. So be careful of giving your kids too much time online. Okay, I'm sure that's not relevant to anyone here though, of course. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time, but I think 2 concepts that have come out of science recently can be helpful in legitimizing some of these traditional ideas about the mind and our relationship to the world and the Tao. The first is the extended mind. Now, this is a mainstream science concept now. Now, this is not the same thing as a psychic experience. It's purely brain-based, okay? It just means that your brain is constantly synchronizing with everything around you, including other people, my voice. For example, if my voice is a bit squeaky, it may actually cause you to have a slight stress response. Okay, that's the way mirror neurons function. Now, social harmony, the traditional idea, can be facilitated, I think, by understanding this synchronization process and how your brain works, and making sure we give people an opportunity to do things together, play together on the same team, solve problems together. This can increase harmony, of course, in Tai Chi. That's a very important part of this process. In fact, some of the studies have been done on people doing these traditional Chinese martial arts, or whatever you want to call Tai. Is Tai Chi a martial art? I guess it is. Yes, it's a martial art. Okay. I know people do it for just exercise and enjoyment, right, as well. Okay. So we synchronize every time we talk to people. When you walk with them down the street, your footsteps will tend to synchronize. When people make love, for example, their heart rates tend to synchronize, and so on. I guess people had fun studying that, but anyway, that's the nature of science. The non-local mind is a slightly different but related concept. Now, this is not mainstream science, but it's similar to the idea of the Tao, or the passage that I read before, that we can sense things that are not in the immediate environment. So this is a very important part of traditional cultures. And it's mostly studied by parapsychologists in the modern age, or people that get called parapsychologists. There's not a lot of money that goes into it, which is a bit of a pity, because some of the experiments are really profound, I think. I actually do this with my students. I set up one experiment. It's just for fun. It's not serious. I don't have a lab. But there's a telephone telepathy experiment where people will sometimes say, I know he's going to call me on the phone before I pick it up, especially in the old days when you couldn't see who was calling. Oh yeah, I know it's my mum. Hello? I was right. So you can test that scientifically, right, fairly easily. You can get a phone and 4 other people and get them to randomly call the person. They have to guess who it is before they pick up the phone. And then you can mathematically and statistically work out whether they could in fact guess higher than the expected rate, which would be 25% if there's 4 people and it's purely random. Okay. My students have fun with that, although some of them do much better than the others. And so far I have not got in trouble from the administrators from doing that. I don't think anybody told them, but anyway. Of course, one of the issues with these things is the idea of superstition, right? And there is some fear of superstition in China's government as well, going back to the Taiping Rebellion and this kind of thing. So there's a negative side to these kind of concepts, but for the most part, I think it's healthy if it's done the right way. So the non-local mind is, I believe it's also studied in near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, and it features heavily in traditional cultures. Now, when you put these two ideas together, the synchronization and the extended mind, it suggests that we really need to make sure that we keep in contact with the body and with our intuition, I believe. I believe they're important ways and important parts of modern society. The digital society should also incorporate some of these values into them. Okay, I'm almost at the end here. So can these wisdom traditions, including those in China, can they be married with science and technology to create what I call a web of wisdom? So again, this is a kind of a model. I'm suggesting, well, it's up to us. It's whether we want to decide to value those things and then to strategize for them and to find out ways that we can implement those. And the values of the modern big tech companies are not necessarily aligned with those things. And people have been conditioned for that kind of dopamine fix, that regular dopamine fix. So we're kind of fighting cultures at the same, and cultures and conditioning and economic systems to try to implement these kind of ideas. But I believe it's just a matter of willpower. So the web of wisdom is basically the idea that in a future ideal society, this is one scenario I came up with, people spend a bit less time online, more time in nature, make sure they balance their lives with some meditative or mindful process in values, intuition, and rationality together in more balance. Okay. And also, as we create the software and hardware of future digital societies, we can incorporate those values into the structure of those systems. Okay, but that may require a different understanding or a different meta-story. Okay, so each culture, each civilization has a story. That story may be implicit. Like the idea that the universe is a big machine, for example, and it's essentially mechanical, and humans are basically robots. We have a brain, and this is the same thing as a brain. That's a story with implicit values, beliefs, metaphors, ways of knowing and being. If we believe that we're machines and that nature is just mechanical, we're not likely to change our behavior in accordance with the kind of traditional ideas I'm talking about. So what might be a better story? Well, one thing might be the idea of an organic, conscious universe. And of course, there are many philosophers and many scientists as well that believe in this or have some understanding of this or believe this is important for us to change our understanding of the universe. And think of our relationship in terms of a different story. Organic just means it's something that's alive. It's not just dead. Now, almost at the end now. How many galaxies are there in the universe? How many? Well, in the year 1900, 124 years ago, we only knew about one galaxy, and that was the Milky Way, our main galaxy. And even then, before that, people didn't even know what it was. It was just, bright lights in the sky. Well, actually, the James Webb Space Telescope data from that suggests there may be somewhere between 6 trillion and 20 trillion galaxies. And each galaxy contain, 100 billion or so stars. So that could mean there could be 1 trillion planets in our own galaxy, plus these other 20 trillion, up to 20 trillion. And who knows what it's going to be in 10, 20, 50 years, what our understanding of the universe is going to be like. Okay? So I think this expanded understanding of the universe is not necessarily harmful to this kind of more spiritual way of looking at the world, I don't think. I think China's in a good position because you still have Chinese medicine and traditions. Universities often have departments of Chinese medicine and so on. Of course, in Western universities, we may have, what do we have that's the equivalent of that? I guess the humanities department is probably the closest that we have. Some universities may have a yoga center and a mosque and a church and so on. But it's not normally part of the core of the university, okay? But I think China, these are popular ideas, and many people in the West are inspired by some of these ideas. I knew about the Tao Te Ching many years ago before I ever came to China, for example, through a spiritual teacher called Stuart Wilde. He was a bit crazy, but in his early days, he was a very good teacher, I think. Okay. If anybody is interested in any collaborations in this kind of area, I'll be happy to hear from you. And that's about all for my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We apologize for the
Well, I have a question, because it's something I'm really interested in, coming from background in research of brush and potential that working with a brush as alternative to all the AI.
A brush, you mean like?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Chinese soft brush, right?
Okay.
Like the soft lines, as opposed to scientific straight lines and things like this. And what are there the possibilities to then reimagine kind of the future and the society for like changing the tool? And also, if we go offline to do this, and if we go into all these things that you were talking about in terms of reconnecting with each other and with the world. But, so I very much believe that there is potential for that, to build a very kind of sustainable, balanced, safe future, right? Relying on this wisdom and tradition. But what are the factual chances to do this? Because I think looking, at economics indicators, right? I mean, the irony of that is that I think there's now much more well-being movement going on, and kind of this inquiry into Chinese thought and meditation and Buddhism in Western societies, because kind of the work frame allows you to get out of the Neijuan frame, right? And have this time to, let's go look at nature and not a laptop when I have to overwork, right? And things like this. So, since you're saying you're kind of thinking about this 10 years kind of future, do you really see that for China there is potential to engage with this wisdom and implement it in factual daily practice for people?
Well, I don't really know what China's going to do about it, or I mean, it's not for me to say whether it's going to happen or not. A lot of it depends on the policy structures. Now, a lot of things that were considered crazy in the past may be quite normalized in the future. So when you look at scenario work, for example, a possible future is the web of wisdom, and it's one scenario or possible future. And you should never throw out less expected futures, because things do tend to change quite a lot. So will it happen in China? I really don't know. As you point out, there are these tensions between the kind of ideas that I'm suggesting and the forces that are against it, including economic forces, the biology of addiction to devices, these kind of things. Perhaps tech companies, governments don't mind the idea of people having their heads stuck in machines all day, because it keeps people out of trouble, right? For the most part, until they explode. Now, a lot of I believe that at least one of the drivers of some of the protests we're seeing in Western countries at the moment is that people are spending many hours, young people are spending many hours online. So they lost their connection with the community and each other, and it creates a kind of trauma. And the sense of meaning and purpose is also being absent. So when they can find something that will suddenly awaken a sense of community and purpose and suddenly get them back out into the body, they'll be out there, And we saw similar things in Hong Kong as well, which I probably can't talk about too much. But I believe there's similar drivers in there. I think this is a possible future for China as well. There may be problems in the future if people, there's the giving up generation, they call it in China, right? So we have to be careful that we make sure that we balance the world and give young people opportunities to express themselves both economically and in terms of their desired future, so that they can express those important parts of themselves. So then they don't get caught up in, rebellions, I don't know all the details of the Taiping Rebellion. That was like 1870, wasn't it, or something like that, a long time ago. But that was a religious movement, The leader there thought he was the incarnated brother of Jesus or something like this. So that's a cult. And you can see a lot of cult-like cultures coming out of Western countries, a lot of conspiracy theory thinking. Even mainstream thinking is, I think, cult-like in some ways. There's a lot of conspiracy thinking in mainstream cultures. It's not just alternative anymore. So that's one of my ideas. Whether it's going to happen, it's up to, there has to be an intentionality in the people and the leaders to work together to create these things. And sometimes it takes a bit of a disaster for people to finally work out something's wrong, because there's not enough incentive until it sort of collapses, and then you've got to rebuild it. So that's probably all I can say at the moment. I hope and I believe it will happen in the long run, and hopefully it won't require either a mini or a total system collapse before it can be implemented. But as you say, there is already a lot of consciousness about these things, but the behaviors of people don't necessarily change after they've gone to the yoga center or to the church on Sunday, right? What do they call it in Christianity? A Sunday Christian. They go to church, and the rest of the week they're beating the dog and or whatever, So the behaviors need to change as well. Kids know about trauma, anxiety, depression. In the universities, they've got 100 diversity, equity, inclusion officers there, but they're still got their head stuck in the phone for many hours a day. We know that from the data. How do you solve that problem? I'm not sure. That's part of the strategizing. That's how people need to get together and work out how to do that, I think.
But then, can I ask another question? Do you have any practices in your teaching that would kind of implement this? Cause I'm thinking next year to do at least one class per semester outdoor solutions like that too.
I've done it in the past. I've done creative visualizations, and this semester, which I haven't quite implemented yet, it takes a bit of courage to do this stuff. I've told my students we're going to be doing it with some meditations, And I do meditations online on my YouTube channel. I put them on there, and I hope to be able. I'm a bit scared to do it, to be quite honest. I'm not quite sure how the students are going to react in China. I haven't not done it in China yet, but
It's okay.
they like
I've
it.
heard people do this. I know a German professor in Shanghai who was doing it.
Okay.
I am
Before the
a
class.
meditation instructor and I've done it.
Okay.
So,
Oh, cool.
certified.
Do you do it here?
Yeah, it's in my curriculum, but I haven't. I'm halfway through the semester back there. I haven't quite got around to doing it. I definitely should do it before the end of the semester. And all these ideas that I'm talking about here, I put these in my curriculum, but it's discussed intellectually, right, which is different, you know. And you know, the idea of following your passion, trying to understand inspiration, these kind of things, you know, the nature of science and society. But yeah, there's a difference between the intellectualizing of it and the actual practice of it. So it is an important aspect of it, yeah.
Because of the time, I saw you have some books on.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And is it meant to show?
Yeah, if anyone is interested, my book is called Power and Presence. It covers
Yes, so
a lot of
I
these
think
topics.
The rest of the
Is in here. This is not specifically about China, but of course it does mention China a few times because, of course, I live in China and I wrote it in China. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. I'm thinking, so how to avoid it and don't to be just a catch-phrase of,
Yes.
nature-oriented?
Well, again, I can only direct you to one incident I know about in Scandinavia, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and maybe Denmark also. Now, most people think of those as very advanced countries, maybe the most advanced in terms of their compassion, their social structure, honouring diversity, women, and all this kind of thing. But before 1900, those countries were actually quite poor. And around about 1910, they developed these kind of trade schools in the Scandinavian countries. And basically, about 10% of the population went into these special schools, and they learned a trade, but they also learned many of the concepts of social science, and I don't know all the curriculum, but it was very, very progressive. It's pretty much the same ideas you see in these modern countries today. It's very, it honours all the diversity of people in the culture, had an environmental focus, and now only 10% of the people went into that system, but they became the leaders of the future. And 30, 40 years later, it blossomed. So that would be a good something for you to study. That I don't know all the details of how that happened. I've just read of it in one particular book. I've forgotten the name of it, but it struck me as a good example of how an initiative put forward by the government transformed a society and quite quickly. There may be some differences. How much of that applies to the modern society? I don't know. But maybe it would be good to draw from that history and see how that might be applied if there is some will to initiate a transformation or a change in, say, Chinese society. But you're right, of course. Policymakers can come up with ideas and put them into the society. Whether that transmits into actual behavior is another thing. Yeah. But I think usually in the long run, it does happen. I think people are more environmentally conscious in China today, would you say? Definitely. When I first came to China in 2002, Beijing was we lived in Beijing, so polluted, and the behavior of people wasn't as refined as it is today. I'm not mentioning anything in particular, but you know what everyone's talking about, right, when they talk about those things. And now it's much, much better. So how did that change? So I don't think that change is impossible. It's a matter of focus and awareness. So you might like to reflect on how is it that people changed from the behaviors that they used to engage in. I remember being in Beijing, went to the computer shop to buy a computer. I'm sorry, this is a slightly uncomfortable anecdote, but I'm looking at the computer at the counter, and there's a guy beside me, he just right at my feet, and I went, oh. But I don't see that anymore in China. So I'm not saying it never happens, but that used to be quite common. So how did that culture change? Did people choose to change it? I don't know. You can think about that, right? So the cultures do change over time, and often positively. Littering used to be common in Australia. People would just throw things on the side of the road. Now almost nobody does it. Government campaigns were quite successful in changing people's behaviours. So always have hope and belief, but it takes courage, it takes commitment, and perhaps collaboration and people skills to be able to find the right people to do it as well. That's what good entrepreneurs can do, right? They know who to connect with, how to get funding, and how to push ideas forward into the community.